Gary DePaul with Unlabel Leadership. Welcome to episode 41. Don Kirkey and Ajay Pangarkar encourage growth. Here's a shout out to listeners in India, in particular, and Himachal Pradesh, Bihar, and Jharkhand. With that, let's get started. In my book, 9 Practices of 21st Century Leadership, I identified 7 leadership principles that I derived from 16 books when I was doing some research on leadership. Number 5 is encourage change. Well, in this episode, I call it encourage growth because it's more accurate to what the definition is about. When you practice leadership, you're helping others to mature their mental and moral qualities, capabilities, and behaviors. And so naturally, a guiding principle is encourage growth. To explore this principle, I invited 2 of my Wednesday regulars to examine and react to 3 related leadership beliefs. And these beliefs are 3 of 26 that I identified in the book. Part 1, mistakes are growth opportunities. In his book, Giving Away Power, Jim Hill writes, "Few things are better for an organization than being known as developer of great talent," which leads me to the belief that's entitled, "Helping others figure out their development enhances their ability to contribute." To begin the dialogue, I asked Don to respond to this belief. Here's Don.
Development always starts at the very foundational building blocks of leadership, which are setting clear, honest, realistic expectations, and then providing honest feedback as people perform. When you set those expectations, they should always include a little stretch. I'm not a big fan of impossible goals. I know that there is a school of management that thinks that's wonderful. I like stretch goals. But I also, in the midst of that, need people to understand that this is a stretch. I expect to support them, and there will be occasionally failures along the way.
And failures is another way of saying learning experiences, right?
There will be wonderful, rich learning experiences.
I do agree with Don. I try to be a little more practical about it. I apply what I believe is that people don't know what they don't know. That acknowledgement of that ignorance, that self-awareness, to me is an opportunity to get people to first acknowledge it, that they don't know what they don't know, and then try to figure out how to find out what they don't know. Because that's where the opportunities lie in growth, in skills and thought, ideas and innovation. As long as that people do that self-discovery, I think, as I've said before in past podcasts with you, Gary, is that's where the opportunity lies for true leadership to facilitate and enable people to grow. Because once they've bought into it, that's the sales pitch, right? That's where they get to do what they need to do because they believe in it. They're not being told to. That's my aspect of how self-development enhances their growth over time.
I agree with Ajay. When I think about expectations and feedback, I think a lot of the expectations should force people a little bit out of their comfort zone. And then this honest feedback will help them, as Ajay is saying, to begin to see themselves, their strengths and their weaknesses more clearly. Because until you're in that place, development is just something that is going to be prescribed by your manager and you're going to do it because you're told to. But once you are in a place where you come to recognize your own strengths and weaknesses in the context of the work that you are doing and are trying to do, then you begin to truly want to develop. Then it doesn't have to be a requirement. It doesn't have to be it is something that people are going to run to their leader and say, I need this, I need that, I need this in order to grow, in order to develop.
I'm going to read you a quotation from Freeberg and Freeberg, who are the authors of Nuts, which was all about Southwest Airlines. Here's the quotation. Find the undeveloped potential in the people with whom you work. Take a moment to see them not as they are, but as they can be. When you do, our bet is 2 things will happen. First, they will act and perform according to the image you have. And second, your faith in their potential of the human spirit will be restored.
That's insightful. I mean, you're fostering the thought process of getting people to go places where things they don't know they can achieve. That's fostering that growth potential, right? And I think it's worthwhile to note that if we're treating people for what they know now, we're not only limiting them, but we're limiting ourselves and our potential as growth as leaders within an organization, and the potential where we can take this organization. When you're looking at what these can be and present those challenges to them, and this is where leaders, I believe, sort of, or managers or leaders, whatever you want to call them, sort of fall down on their face a bit here. When they place challenges, it's more of a like trying to put out a fire. When I speak about challenges, it's about stimulating thought. And when you put challenges or problems in front of them, they will grow. People typically will step up to the plate and face that challenge and try to solve it. Because intrinsically, I mean, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not an anthropologist by no means. The anecdotal perception I have is that people love solving problems. Human beings are designed to solve problems. Put a riddle in front of anybody and we're all trying to think out how to solve it. And so if you do that kind of thing to help them grow, not to put out a fire, that's where you're going to start achieving, fulfilling that kind of quote where you're putting people in a place where they are achieving something and something interesting, and allowing that level of failure, that possibility of failure, because that's where a lot of learning will take place.
I was thinking the same thing. One of the things that I have seen often working with senior managers is this attitude that some of their employees are broken and need to be fixed. And I think, to play on Ajay's point, it's not just a matter of linguistics when you start talking about things as challenges. So it's not failures that we're dealing with, it's challenges, it's opportunities for growth. And when you start having that more positive mindset, you approach development people differently. You approach your people differently. They are not broken gizmos and widgets that need to be fixed. They are human beings that want to grow. There's very few of us that don't want to learn and grow and get better.
We were at the same company at the time. This is a couple of decades ago, by the way. You were in another department, but you knew my boss at the time, Louis Ladouceur. I don't know if I should name him on a podcast, but he was a great guy, in my opinion. I think he put me in charge in the department for helping solve some of the defect returns on some of the equipment we're getting into the facility. And we were dealing with industrial equipment. I was young. I was in my late 20s at the time, or mid to late 20s. And Louis put me in charge of that, knowing that he had other staff that had more experience than me. But he looked at me and he says, look, I know you have, the capacity of trying to help us, manage and mitigate or improve this area. And I'm sitting there sort of like a deer in the headlights going, what do I know? And he says, I have faith in you. He goes, bring up some ideas and let's talk about it. But that subtle thing sort of resonated with me, because it was like he put that challenge in front of me and encouraged me to find the solution. And it became that riddle to solve. And without the experience, and maybe he looked at me like, you don't have the baggage, and maybe that's what pushed him to get me to do it. But that leadership capacity speaks to that growth in me that I still recall 20 plus years later. So it's an interesting concept that's where you want people to go, even though it was almost a bit of a putting out a fire thing, but he was trying to advance the problem to become better. And so that was where the fire would not continue to flame up every so often, and help solve it eventually. And that was sort of a live example in my life as an influence by a leader.
I remember that leader, and I agree. He was a very good leader. He exemplified what I was trying to get at right at the beginning, which is this idea of setting stretch goals and stretch expectations that encourage you, period, but also encourage you to develop and grow and realize some of the potential that's there. The manager who tells you shut up and get back to work is not going to get much out of you.
It comes to that point that manager, he could have taken another route and say, we just have to fix it. Either dictated the solution or sort of mandated come up with one solution, but he allowed that creativity to flourish, and very, very important.
Part 2, the next level of success could be elsewhere. As a manager of people, you want those who report to you to grow and develop mentally and morally. And at some point, a person's role starts to limit their development. The work becomes easier to accomplish, less challenging, and starts to lose interest. As a manager, you benefit by having to spend less time developing those stars. Unfortunately, wanting them to stay in their role is selfish and not in their best interest. Instead, you should help them find a role that would be more challenging. The leadership belief I'm describing is this: encouraging people to grow and leave their role contributes to organizational growth. It's an unusual belief, and I wanted to find out from Ajay and Don what they thought about it. Ajay begins the discussion. Here's Ajay.
Encouraging people to grow and leave their role for the organization to grow is an interesting concept, because basically it's the same thing that we tell our kids about how mama bird has to kick the baby birds out of the nest to fly on their own. Or the old saying that we always say, if you love something, set them free, they'll come back to you. If they don't, kind of thing. And I'm being a little altruistic here, but at the end of the day, if you let people go and grow into other areas, and when they come back, even within the organization, from your department to another department, when they come back, they have a less of the blinders on and more of a wider perspective of cross-functional problem solving. And they can bring new ideas to the table and not be constrained by, the invisible handcuffs sometimes we put on in an organization, where this is the way you have to do things in our department or in our area. And even if they leave the company, people always, in the old days, and I say old days, 20 plus years ago, if somebody left the company, the company would never take them back. And I'm like, well, if they left, they probably became better people. And if they're coming back, they're bringing all that new skill set and experience back with them. Why wouldn't you want to take it back? Because they already know the company in the first stage when they were with us. And now they're coming back with more wonderful stuff with them. So why would we not want to take them back? So it's a little short-sightedness if people don't let people go and grow. And it's a scary thing, because resources are tight, it's limited. And so we have to, it's a scary thing to let people go off and wander, because you may not ever get them back. But if you treated them well in the first place, you have an opportunity to bring that skill back into your organization.
I want to play on something Ajay was saying, because if this issue of treating them well, if you treat talent as though it was a zero-sum game, then you really are going to be in trouble. When someone leaves your team to move to another team in the same organization, you're going to think of that as a loss. Talent is not a zero sum. Their talent is infinitely growable if you are the right leader and you're approaching your people the right way. And I think that if you have developed these people and they step up to roles elsewhere in the organization, particularly, there is a power and an influence that comes to you for being the person who has mentored, who has brought these people on board, has mentored and developed them, and then turned them loose on the organization. Your influences and your sphere of influence is only going to grow when that sort of thing happens.
Can I add to your point, Don? It's very important that you recognize that people need to grow and sometimes need to leave. I mean, as a leader, I've managed several different types of departments. And one thing I never wanted to stand in the way of people's growth and potential is to handcuff them to our team or our department. And sometimes, just recently, I remember a team member on a team I was leading, I said to them, I said, I hate to lose you, but you have so much more potential that you can contribute to this other team that I think you need to go there, and you need to, help them and contribute to that growth there. And it takes a little bit of courage as a manager and a leader to lose that resource, because you grow dependent on these people. They do good work for you and you're helping them grow. And as Don says, you mentored them and helped them flourish. But at the same time, you sometimes got to kick them out of the nest for your own good and put them into areas that you feel they need to, first of all, leverage their strengths and capacity, but through that they will grow even further. And as Don says, if you continue to treat them well and it's not a zero-sum game, they probably will come back, or down the road they'll eventually become a better ally for you in their other departments. So there's a lot of advantages for doing this.
That's true. If someone actually leaves the organization to go somewhere else, you may have lost that person as a resource, but if there was no room to grow up or move across, when they're at that other organization, they're going to reflect how you led them and your reputation goes with them as well.
You grow a reputation that's very strong. I mean, you grow a reputation that people want to now work for you because you're that type of leader that's going to help them grow and flourish. You're planting the seeds in these people too, because they'll carry that same attitude or to a certain extent in their new roles as they grow into leaders.
Gary, in a previous podcast, we talked about leaders whose desire is the success of those who work for them. And if we're serious about that concept, then as both of you are saying, sometimes that success is going to be elsewhere. And you grieve when wonderful people leave, but there's a satisfaction as well in the part that you play. Building a pipeline at an organizational level is still something that all healthy organizations need to think about.
Good leaders know that pipeline. Weak leaders or weak managers fail to fill that pipeline.
Well, and in fact, weak leaders are often the plug in the pipeline.
Yes.
Part 3, On the Edge. Liz Wiseman wrote, "If you want your organization to take risks, you have to separate the experiment from the outcome." And this leads me to belief number 17 from my list of 26 beliefs about leadership. Allowing teams to make mistakes enables them to be open with their mistakes and learn from the experience. At some organizations, the culture is unforgiving when teams make mistakes or fail, but the managers wonder why teams aren't creative or innovative. I asked Don and Ajay about the complexity around allowing mistakes and learning from them. Don begins the conversation. Here's Don.
I'm going to quote a former manager of mine. He used to encourage us all to stretch and to grow and to try to tackle more. And he would always quip, if you're not on the edge, you're probably taking up too much space. The other side of that idea, and I agree with my boss, Art, the other side of that idea is that sometimes you're going to fall off the edge. And so we have to find a way that people can stretch and grow and occasionally fail inside of an organization. As long as the failure is not a failure that is grounded in ethical or moral issues, we have to understand that people will make mistakes and we have to give them room to make those in order that they can grow.
I learned that saying from a friend of mine too. If you're not living life in the edge, you're taking up too much space. I love that thought because it's always pushing you to the edge where you need to go into areas where you've not discovered yet. And you have to channel that unknown and that fear into something positive. One of my bosses, he said to me, he goes, "Look, try whatever you need to, Ajay." And I'm like, okay. And it was my first real job and my first real boss. He goes, "But there is a little caveat." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Do your due diligence." He goes, "Make sure you do your research." He goes, "I don't want you to fail for the sake of failing." He goes, "I want you to fail because you've learned something out of it. But at the same time, I really don't want you to fail." I agree that people should make mistakes because that's where the learning takes place. And that's what his intent was. But he also said to me, he goes, "You have to do your homework. Be a critical thinker, do your research, make sure that you're limited your failure or you limit the damage of the failure that may happen. The more homework you do, the more success you'll find." Those kind of lessons stuck with me. I tell that to young people now, like, this is what my boss taught me when I was your age, and it's helped me out in life significantly. We're not guaranteed to succeed at everything, but we can mitigate the risk of failing. And if we do fail, the damage will be limited, and hopefully we'll have learned something that we've missed or overlooked that we can take away and do better the next time we try it. And I think that's where we really need to allow people to, we go back to that first question about getting people to development, get their skill set and their thoughts. That's part of that, mitigating the failure. It's not that I don't want them to fail. I want you to limit your failure, learn from it, and do better next time. That's really where, from my past experiences, has fed a lot.
I was thinking about one of the reasons why people fail. Lack of or incomplete or unsuccessful planning is one of them. Another one that comes to mind is assumptions that are made that are invalid. In tackling any new project, we'll question everything. I think that's critical. There is a certain amount of failure that comes from ignorance in the sense of things that people do not know. But often it's not the things that they don't know that bite them, it's the things they assume that are hurting them. I don't want to give people a blank check and say, go ahead and fail. I know there's some organizations that famously tell you to fail and fail and fail again. I have reservations about that as an approach. But I also want to leave room for people making honest mistakes through misunderstanding, through assumptions, through a lack of knowledge. We gain and learn through experience. And as all three of us know very well, it's the failures and the painful experiences that are the greatest learning opportunities.
Well, Don, you said something earlier that was very interesting. One thing that I do that you just stated was question everything. And maybe it's my sort of CPA background or my consulting experience. Even if things I know are going to be successful, I will continue to question it. And people take that as negativity, and it's not negativity, it's sort of reassurance and sort of dotting I's and crossing the T's that make sure that we have that critical thinking. And I don't think a lot of people have built in that critical thinking ability, which you speak to about questioning, Don. Subsequently to that, you mentioned it earlier, was the honest and frankness that you have to have with people in a very professional manner, naturally, but you have to be straight up and be able to take that questioning and critique, I guess, if you want to call it anything, back to make sure it's improved. Because like you said, you don't want people to make mistakes for the sake of making mistakes. If they make it, it's just, it happened. We overlooked something or something happened, but it's minor. And I think those are very important points when you allow people to make mistakes.
I think, Ajay, when people know and genuinely believe that your goal is to help them be successful, then they're much more open to honest and direct feedback. If the direct feedback comes because you haven't made them, the leader, look good, then that's not, that's harder to take, harder to accept, harder to believe. But if I genuinely believe that the person I'm working for wants me to be successful, they can tell me a whole lot of tough stuff.
That brings up the point, Gary. Don brings up a good point, because in one of our previous podcasts, I spoke about ego getting in the way.
Oh, yeah.
Speaking about that, about how leaders sometimes let their egos get in the way, whether it's subconsciously or not. They don't park their ego. It's not about making the leader look good. It's about the leader making the team succeed.
There's another aspect of this, and that is the role of people in management, allowing people to make mistakes. You have constraints where you provide coaching and you want to set people up for success, but stuff happens. And the mantra in a lot of organizations is fail fast, recover, and learn. But in reality, a lot of our people say that, but then they turn around and they punish you, if I can use that word. They say, yes, you made these mistakes. And for companies that have annual performance reviews, they hold those things against them, but not the fact that they learned from those mistakes.
It's coming to mind. I can't think of the names of the companies right now, but they're a little more progressive in their performance appraisals, where they do have a mistake quotient, or I don't know what they call it, but one of those failure type quotients in the performance appraisal. And it's not to punish people, it's actually to encourage people. But again, as we've been discussing here, those companies are not just saying, hey, the more mistakes you make, the more you'll be evaluated favorably in your performance. No, they won't be punished, but there's a framework and boundaries around that failure about why did the failure occur? How did they occur? What did they do? And all this kind of stuff that encourages them to learn from it. It takes a really different mindset to do that. And it really needs to be defined that yes, we can make mistakes. Yes, we can make failures. Don't think you're going to be rewarded for them. However, you'll be rewarded for them if we can grow from it. It's a bit of a shift in how we look at things as far as mistakes, that there's opportunities that lies in those mistakes, not punishment.
There's a balance that you have to have.
People are going to make mistakes. We just have to start with that premise. People will make mistakes. We are human beings. All of us are flawed. Some of us are deeply flawed, but we are human beings. The question that you have to ask is twofold. One of them is, why did the mistake occur? And is this, as I said earlier, a question of morals, ethics, or the law? Is it a question of a lack of planning, poor assumptions, ignorance? So you do need to understand why the mistake occurred. But the really real power in this is to help the person use that mistake. So my question when my employees have failed is, what are you going to do differently? What have you learned? What did you take out of that? And in fact, that's often an interview question that I will ask. Tell me about your most spectacular failure in the last 2 years. How did it happen and what did you learn from it? What I'm interested in is a person who is prepared to be honest about themselves and is willing to learn from their mistakes. I think that is something that I would look for and want to add to my team. Mistakes are good. If someone is never making a mistake, I suspect they need to be stretched a little. And if they're always making mistakes, then you do have to question fit for role. But mistakes are going to be normal.
The concept of mistake quotient intrigues me, and I'm beginning to think that what you were saying, Don, is part of what that mistake quotient. You've made a mistake, but if you show that you learn from that and you recover and you show that you behave differently because of it, then that falls into that mistake quotient.
Again, this is really a difficult thing to define, right? Because as Don says, we're human, right? We're going to make errors, and it's part of it. As humans, we're meant to progress, and as we progress, we move into areas that we don't know, and they're going to be unknowns, and we're going to trip up on ourselves, and we're going to learn from it, and so forth. And mistakes are going to occur. That's good. The bad is what types of mistakes are there, what type of errors are happening. Don says that if they're being repeated and over again, are we saying that person is not learning? Is it the person that's not learning? Or is it the conditions or the environment that's not conducive for that person to learn from those mistakes? There's a lot of moving parts here, but it does take the diligence of a person, a leader, to be able to be astute enough to look at that and use their judgment to be able to frame that properly. So going back to that mistake quotient, whatever we want to call it, but to frame it properly and not necessarily penalize them for the sake of because they made several mistakes, but with all the elements that go around it.
In a previous podcast, we've talked about vulnerable leaders, and I think vulnerable leaders start with the recognition that they too have made mistakes in the past and are probably still making them from time to time. It is an honest, self-reflective, vulnerable leader avoids the self-righteousness that you see in some managers who really want to wail on an employee who's made an honest mistake. It does, in my mind, circle back ultimately to the character and the practices and the behaviors of the leader themselves.
My thanks to Ajay Pangarkar and Don Kirkey. If you'd like to learn more about them, go to the show notes. And if you'd like to leave a comment or question, then go to unlabelleadership.com, click the message icon, and you can leave a voicemail message up to 1 minute. I'd like to thank those who support the show. Your support helps with the production cost. But most importantly, I'd like to thank you, the listener, for listening. With that, until next time, lead on.